A glamorous fashion designer, known for her elegance and success, was found dead in her luxurious Texas mansion. But what was the real reason behind her tragic end? Could it be the secret relationship with her younger lover that turned deadly? The life of a successful fashion designer seemed flawless. Cheryl St. James had built her empire from the ground up. Wealth, beauty, influence, everything seemed to be in her grasp. But beneath the polished surface of her glamorous world, the darkness was quietly creeping in. A young, charismatic man had entered her life, lured by the riches she offered. His charm and good looks made him irresistible, and for Cheryl, he was more than just a lover, he was a symbol of indulgence, of pleasure, of everything she desired to hold on to in a life that was starting to unravel. But when love becomes entangled with obsession, when wealth blinds someone to their own safety, the consequences can be deadly. Cheryl's sugar boy, the young man she had given everything to, had become more than just a companion. He had become an anchor in her life, but also something far more dangerous, a time bomb waiting to explode. Cheryl never saw it coming. She never expected that the man she had cared for would turn on her. The night of her murder was like any other. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing seemed unusual. But that night, everything changed. The world would later find out that the death of Cheryl St. James wasn't just the result of a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was something far more calculated, something much more devastating than anyone had imagined. A young man who had been given everything, a life of luxury, access to a future filled with wealth, had become the very thing that would destroy her. Her death sent shockwaves through the fashion industry, through the social circles where she had once been queen. But what was the true motive behind the murder? Was it greed, betrayal, or something else entirely? Why would someone with so much to lose, someone who had been given every opportunity, choose to take the life of the woman who had provided it all? As detectives scoured the crime scene, piecing together Cheryl's last moments, they uncovered secrets about her life that no one had known, relationships she had kept hidden, choices that painted a much darker picture than anyone could have imagined. Cheryl's story wasn't just one of ambition and success. It was a story of manipulation, lies, and a desire for control, where the stakes were high, and the consequences were deadly. And now, as the investigation unfolds, the question on everyone's mind remains: what drove her lover to murder her in cold blood? What was the final straw that led him to destroy everything he had been given? This case is more than just a tragic loss. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and the horrifying lengths people are willing to go to when they feel they have been wronged. It's a story about the dangers that can hide behind the most polished of facades. And it's a story that, once it unfolds, will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, greed, and betrayal. Stay with us as we dive deeper into this chilling case. Each piece of the puzzle holds more questions than answers. What really happened in that mansion? What could have led a young man to murder the woman who had given him everything? The truth might be more shocking than you ever expected. As the investigation into Cheryl St. James' murder deepened, the detectives began to unravel a series of disturbing truths. On the surface, everything seemed perfect: her glamorous lifestyle, her empire built from years of hard work, and her carefully curated public persona. But behind the curtains of this seemingly perfect life, Cheryl had been harboring secrets that would leave everyone shocked. Her relationship with the man who would eventually become her killer, the so-called sugar boy, was far more complex than it had appeared. At first, it had seemed like the perfect arrangement: a beautiful, successful woman with all the riches in the world, and a young man eager to enjoy the finer things in life. But, as detectives began to dig into his background, they discovered a darker, more sinister side to their relationship. This wasn't just a romance, it was a transaction, built on the premise of power, control, and manipulation. His name was Marcus Davis, a young man in his early 20s, full of ambition and charm. He had arrived in Cheryl's world after a chance encounter, and from that moment, things moved quickly. Cheryl had taken him under her wing, lavishing him with expensive gifts, trips, and attention. At first, Marcus had appeared grateful, enjoying the fruits of Cheryl's labor. But soon, his gratitude began to twist into something darker, more entitled. It was clear that Marcus was no longer just her companion, he had begun to expect the luxuries that came with being a part of Cheryl's life. Behind closed doors, their relationship had become increasingly strained. Marcus was becoming more demanding, more controlling. He wanted more money, more access, more influence. He had begun to resent Cheryl's success, feeling that he deserved more than what she was giving him. As the months passed, he had begun to treat her less like a partner and more like an object to be used. Cheryl, always the sharp businesswoman, began to sense the change in him. She had seen his growing greed, his need for control. But she was reluctant to confront it. Perhaps, like many women before her, she had convinced herself that love, however twisted, would somehow fix the situation. She had hoped that with time, things would settle, that Marcus would come to appreciate the life she had given him. But, as the investigation revealed, things were only getting worse. Detectives uncovered a series of text messages between Cheryl and Marcus that painted a picture of a relationship that was far from loving. In these texts, Marcus repeatedly demanded more from Cheryl, more money, more gifts, more validation. He wanted to be more than just her companion, he wanted to be in control of everything. And when Cheryl began to set boundaries, Marcus' true nature began to emerge. There were late-night arguments, often fueled by jealousy and accusations. Marcus accused Cheryl of not loving him enough, of not providing him with the lifestyle he thought he deserved. Cheryl, frustrated and weary, had tried to end the relationship more than once, but Marcus wouldn't let go. His grip on her tightened, and the tension between them grew unbearable. One of Cheryl's closest friends later testified that Cheryl had confided in her about the increasing strain in her relationship with Marcus. She had spoken about his mood swings, his unpredictable behavior, and his growing demands. Cheryl had even started to hint that she felt trapped in a relationship with a man who no longer saw her as a partner, but as a source of endless supply. It was clear to those who knew her best that Cheryl was conflicted. She was a woman of immense strength, but the emotional toll of this relationship was beginning to break her down. The woman who had conquered the fashion world, who had built a brand that represented power and beauty, was now struggling to control her own personal life. As the detectives continued their investigation, they discovered that Marcus had been hiding more than just his true feelings for Cheryl. They found evidence of financial irregularities, suggesting that Marcus had been siphoning off large amounts of money from Cheryl's accounts, using her credit cards without her permission. He had been living a life funded entirely by Cheryl, and when she had started to question his behavior, he began to fear that she would eventually cut him off. This fear, coupled with his sense of entitlement, led to an explosion of violence. On the night of Cheryl's death, the tension had reached a boiling point. Cheryl had confronted Marcus about the stolen money, demanding answers. The argument quickly escalated. According to forensic evidence, Cheryl had tried to defend herself, but Marcus overpowered her. In a fit of rage, he attacked her, and in the process, fatally injured her. But the brutality of Cheryl's death didn't stop there. The murder wasn't an impulsive act of passion, it was calculated. Marcus had made sure that Cheryl's death would look like a robbery gone wrong. He staged the crime scene to make it seem as though someone had broken in, hoping to confuse investigators and delay suspicion. But the evidence didn't lie. Forensic analysis of the scene, combined with the disturbing revelations about their relationship, pointed directly to Marcus. The police quickly arrested Marcus, and the case made headlines across the country. The shocking murder of a wealthy, successful fashion designer by her own lover was a story that captivated the public. The media painted a picture of a tragic love story gone wrong, but the truth was far more chilling. As Marcus stood trial for Cheryl's murder, the courtroom was filled with emotions, grief, anger, disbelief. Cheryl's family and friends struggled to comprehend how someone they had trusted could turn on her so violently. But the prosecution was clear in its case. Marcus Davis had killed Cheryl out of greed and jealousy, unable to cope with the idea of losing the lavish lifestyle she had given him. The trial was long and emotionally charged, with expert witnesses testifying about Marcus' mental state and his escalating behavior. Cheryl's friends spoke of her generosity and her struggle to maintain control over a relationship that had turned toxic. The defense tried to argue that Marcus was not fully responsible for his actions, suggesting that he had been influenced by his troubled past. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for hours before finally returning with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Cheryl's family could barely contain their emotions. For them, the loss of Cheryl was something that could never be undone. The woman they had loved, who had built a legacy with her own hands, was gone, taken from them by someone she had trusted. The aftermath of Cheryl's death reverberated through the fashion industry, through the circles she had once dominated. The scandal shook the city of Dallas to its core, and the story of the wealthy designer and her killer lover became a cautionary tale about trust, greed, and the dangers of blind ambition. In the end, the tragic tale of Cheryl St. James was a reminder of the price of trusting the wrong person. It was a story about love gone wrong, about betrayal, and about the destructive power of greed. Cheryl's death would forever be a haunting reminder of how easily a life built on success and ambition can be destroyed by a single moment of weakness, a single misstep in the pursuit of power. But even as justice was served, the question lingered: was it possible to truly know someone, even someone you had given everything to? And could it ever really be enough? The story of Cheryl St. James, the wealthy Texas fashion designer, was a case that stunned the nation. It left everyone asking the same question: how could someone who seemingly had it all, power, wealth, success, fall victim to such a brutal betrayal? The investigation into her murder had uncovered a trail of lies, manipulation, and greed, but there was still so much left to uncover. The details were chilling, and with each new revelation, the narrative grew darker. In the days following Cheryl's death, the authorities combed through every aspect of her life. They spoke to those who knew her best: her family, her colleagues, her friends. And slowly, the full extent of her relationship with Marcus Davis came to light. It wasn't just that Marcus had been her sugar boy, as many had called him; he was far more than that. He had ingrained himself into her life, her business, and even her social circle. He had become a fixture in her world, and for a time, Cheryl had treated him as someone she could trust, someone she believed cared for her. But that trust, it seemed, had been misplaced. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Marcus had been involved in other unsavory dealings, ones that Cheryl had no knowledge of. His past was murky, with reports of minor thefts, fraud, and manipulative behavior. But in Cheryl's eyes, he was just a charming young man, eager to learn about the high society lifestyle she had cultivated. She had seen potential in him, and in many ways, she had hoped to mold him into something more. What she hadn't seen was his growing resentment, his belief that he was entitled to much more than what she was offering him. The detective soon discovered that Marcus had been deep in debt before he met Cheryl. He had lived a life of luxury on borrowed time, constantly in need of money to maintain the image of success he so desperately wanted to project. Cheryl's wealth had allowed him to live a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own. But as his addiction to material wealth deepened, so did his sense of entitlement. He began to see Cheryl less as a benefactor and more as a means to an end. One of the more shocking revelations came when the police discovered a series of texts and emails between Marcus and several other individuals. These communications revealed that Marcus had been planning his next steps long before Cheryl's murder. He had been seeking out new avenues for financial gain, some legal, some not. What was most disturbing was that in these messages, he had expressed frustration with Cheryl's increasing hesitance to give him more money. It was clear that he wanted more than just luxury. He wanted control over her wealth, and when that control slipped from his grasp, he snapped. The night of the murder began like any other. Cheryl had invited Marcus to her lavish penthouse, a place that had once been their sanctuary, a space where they could share intimate moments. But on this night, the mood was different. The air between them was thick with tension. Cheryl had noticed the changes in Marcus, his coldness, his demands, his growing distance. She had tried to confront him in the past, but each time, he had deflected. This time, however, Cheryl couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had told her closest friend that she was planning to end things with him for good. She couldn't continue a relationship with someone who had become more of a burden than a companion. But Marcus had other plans. He had already made up his mind. The thought of losing access to Cheryl's wealth, the life she had provided for him, was more than he could bear. As the evening wore on, a heated argument ensued. Cheryl had demanded that Marcus leave her apartment. She had told him that she was done, that he could no longer rely on her for support. But Marcus, in a fit of rage, attacked her. The evidence suggested that he had struck her several times before finally choking her with his hands. Cheryl fought back, but the violence was overwhelming. In the aftermath of the murder, Marcus tried to stage the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He ransacked the apartment, looking for anything of value that he could take. He knew the police would investigate every inch of the crime scene, so he carefully removed Cheryl's personal items from view, hoping to throw them off the trail. But despite his best efforts, the evidence didn't lie. Forensic analysis revealed traces of Marcus' fingerprints on the murder weapon, and DNA samples matched him to the crime scene. As the case against him built, Marcus' behavior grew more erratic. He began to change his story, claiming that he had been at Cheryl's apartment that night, but only to pick up his belongings. He denied any involvement in her death, but his lies only grew more transparent as the investigation continued. His friends and family became increasingly concerned, and many began to question how they hadn't seen the true nature of his character before. When the trial began, it was clear that the courtroom would be an emotional battlefield. Cheryl's family and friends had been devastated by her death. They had lost a beloved sister, a cherished daughter, a mentor, and a friend. The person they had once trusted and welcomed into their circle had turned out to be a cold-blooded killer. The victim's side of the courtroom was filled with raw emotion, grief, anger, disbelief, but there was also an underlying sense of justice. They wanted to make sure that Marcus would never hurt anyone again. The defense, of course, tried to paint Marcus as a victim of circumstance. They claimed that he had been manipulated by Cheryl, that he had fallen into a cycle of dependency and was pushed to his breaking point. They argued that he had been incapable of controlling his emotions at the time of the murder. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They presented evidence of Marcus' cold, calculated planning, his growing resentment toward Cheryl, and his clear motive, greed. Throughout the trial, the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the text messages, the financial records, the testimonies from Cheryl's friends and colleagues, all of which painted a portrait of a man who had used Cheryl to fuel his own selfish desires. The key to the case was the undeniable fact that Marcus had not only murdered Cheryl, but he had done so with the intention of seizing control of her life and her fortune. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Marcus Davis was convicted of first-degree murder, and as the judge read the sentence, Cheryl's family broke down in tears. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing Cheryl was something that could never be undone. In the years that followed, the story of Cheryl St. James continued to haunt those who knew her. Her death had sent shockwaves through the fashion world, and the lessons learned from her tragic end resonated deeply with those who had been closest to her. The lesson was clear: appearances can be deceiving, and no amount of wealth or success can protect you from the darkness that can lie within the hearts of those you trust most. Cheryl's legacy would live on in the designs she created, in the lives she touched, and in the cautionary tale of how greed and manipulation can destroy even the brightest stars. And as for Marcus Davis, his life was over in every way that mattered. The dreams of luxury and fame he had once pursued so desperately had ended in a prison cell, and he would never again taste the life he had once lived. For him, there would be no redemption, only the cold reality of the consequences of his actions. And so, the story of Cheryl St. James, the wealthy Texas fashion designer murdered by her sugar boy, became not just a tale of betrayal, but a reminder of the dangerous power of greed, entitlement, and the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly perfect life. As the years passed, The case of Cheryl St. James became a point of reference for the dangers lurking in the world of wealth, manipulation, and greed. Her story was shared across documentaries, news outlets, and even in whispered conversations in high society circles. For those who knew her best, Cheryl's death was more than just a tragedy, it was a cautionary tale of the unspoken dangers of relationships built on false pretenses. But what many didn't know was that the murder of Cheryl St. James didn't just end with the conviction of Marcus Davis. In fact, the story didn't even end with his trial. As time went on, disturbing details began to surface about how much of Marcus's life had been intertwined with the world Cheryl had tried so desperately to protect her own from, the world of manipulation, lies, and deceit. Despite the conviction, there were lingering questions about whether Marcus had been acting alone. The more investigators peeled back the layers of his life, the clearer it became that there were others involved, people who had aided him, even if unknowingly, by creating the perfect storm in which Marcus's manipulation had flourished. In the months following Marcus's conviction, Cheryl's family launched a new investigation into her murder. They had hoped that with the trial behind them, they could finally start healing, but something didn't sit right. The family believed that Marcus hadn't acted alone, and with the reopening of the investigation, they discovered something chilling, a set of connections between Marcus and people who had used Cheryl's success for their own gain. People she had trusted, worked with, and even called friends. The first piece of the puzzle came when Cheryl's business partner, Veronica Hughes, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Her death initially seemed unrelated to the case, but as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered troubling facts. Veronica had been the last person to speak to Cheryl on the night she was murdered. She had called Cheryl hours before the murder to discuss a business meeting, a conversation that Cheryl had abruptly ended. That final phone call was key in connecting Veronica to Marcus Davis in ways no one had anticipated. Upon closer investigation, it was revealed that Veronica had been heavily involved in Cheryl's finances, so much so that she had access to all of the designer's accounts. Cheryl's family had no idea, but the detectives uncovered that Veronica and Marcus had been in constant contact leading up to the murder. What was more disturbing was the discovery of a secret offshore account that both Veronica and Marcus had access to. This account, with a sizable sum of money, had been created under Cheryl's name, though she had no knowledge of it. Veronica's mysterious death was ruled as an overdose, but the circumstances were too convenient to ignore. The authorities began to suspect that Veronica had either been involved in Cheryl's murder, or perhaps she had been silenced to prevent her from revealing secrets that could expose the extent of the scheme. Marcus had clearly been the mastermind, but Veronica's role in manipulating Cheryl's financial empire was undeniable. Meanwhile, the true extent of Marcus's influence on Cheryl was coming to light. Cheryl's friends spoke of how the designer had become distant and secretive in the months leading up to her death. She had stopped trusting those closest to her, including her childhood friends, who had all felt a shift in her behavior. It was as though Marcus had been slowly and quietly cutting Cheryl off from the people who cared about her the most. A deep dive into Cheryl's personal diary revealed entries that showed signs of emotional turmoil. She had documented moments of uncertainty, times when Marcus had pushed her for more money, more power, more control over her business dealings. But what was most disturbing was the final entry in her diary, written just days before her death. Cheryl had written that she was planning to sever all ties with Marcus, to free herself from the suffocating grip he had over her. But she had also written that she feared what might happen if she did. As the investigation into Veronica's death and the involvement of others gained traction, Marcus's reaction was anything but innocent. Behind bars, Marcus had started to become more vocal about his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He had maintained that he acted out of desperation, but now he claimed that he had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game in which Cheryl's wealth and influence had attracted a dangerous web of people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Marcus began to implicate others in his actions, suggesting that Cheryl's business empire had been filled with people just as greedy and manipulative as he was. He claimed that Veronica, along with other figures from Cheryl's past, had been complicit in a plan to force Cheryl into a corner, financially, emotionally, and psychologically. It was this manipulation, according to Marcus, that led him to murder Cheryl. However, his confession seemed more like an attempt to pass the blame on to others. The more Marcus spoke, the more the case grew murky. He named several individuals who had been close to Cheryl, and investigators were forced to look into these new suspects. Some of them were minor players, business associates and acquaintances, but others were much more significant. Cheryl's personal assistant, Tiffany Monroe, had been involved in handling her day-to-day business transactions, and Tiffany's sudden resignation just days before the murder raised a lot of red flags. Investigators found that Tiffany had been involved in some questionable activities, including embezzlement and unauthorized withdrawals from Cheryl's business accounts. Had she been part of a larger scheme? Was she in league with Marcus? Or was she another pawn caught in a game she couldn't control? In the months that followed, new evidence came to light that further complicated the case. Investigators discovered a hidden camera system installed in Cheryl's office, which she had used for security purposes. After much deliberation, the authorities were able to recover footage from the days leading up to her death. What they saw was chilling. Marcus had been at Cheryl's office, speaking with Veronica and Tiffany, but what was most alarming was what they said. The footage revealed that they had been discussing a large sum of money, a deal that was about to be finalized by Cheryl herself. It became clear that Marcus and Veronica had planned to kill Cheryl after her decision to cancel the deal, one that would have guaranteed them both millions. As the investigation continued, detectives realized that the web of corruption surrounding Cheryl's murder was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Marcus had been the catalyst, but Veronica and Tiffany, along with other unnamed individuals, had all played key roles in ensuring Cheryl's demise. The chilling realization that Cheryl had been the victim of not just a murder but a complex financial conspiracy made her case one of the most shocking in recent history. In the courtroom, the trial of Marcus Davis continued, but now with new evidence implicating others. With the mounting pressure of the investigation, the defense tried to argue that Marcus was simply a pawn in a larger game. But the prosecution, armed with the new evidence, tore down his story piece by piece. The jury was forced to confront a truth that was even more horrifying than they had first believed: the murder of Cheryl St. James was the result of a dark conspiracy of greed, manipulation, and betrayal, one that had been years in the making. The truth about Cheryl's murder was no longer just a tragic tale of a young woman caught up in the consequences of her own success. It was a lesson in the dangers of trust, the fragility of relationships, and the ugly reality of the lengths some people would go to for power and money. As Marcus Davis faced the consequences of his actions, the victims, the family and friends of Cheryl St. James, could only hope that they would finally find peace. But even then, the legacy of Cheryl's life would live on, not just in the fashion world, but in the chilling reminder of the destructive power of betrayal. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the murder of Cheryl St. James was only the beginning of a much larger, more complex story. The authorities were no longer just dealing with a murder, but with an intricate web of deception, betrayal, and greed that spanned across multiple layers of Cheryl's life. As more details emerged, they uncovered a twisted tale of high society manipulation, financial crimes, and ruthless ambition. It wasn't long before Cheryl's family, still grappling with their grief, began to realize that Cheryl had been living a life far removed from the one they had known. Behind her successful career as a fashion designer, Cheryl had been increasingly isolated, a woman trapped by the very success she had fought so hard to achieve. She had built an empire, but with that empire came enemies, some of whom had been in plain sight all along. People she trusted, people she had considered friends, were now suspects in a case that seemed to grow more complicated with every new lead. One of the most shocking revelations came from Cheryl's lawyer, who came forward with a startling piece of evidence, a series of legal documents that revealed Cheryl had been preparing to change her will just days before her murder. These documents, which had been discovered among her personal belongings, indicated that Cheryl had planned to disinherit several key individuals, including her business partner Veronica Hughes and her personal assistant Tiffany Monroe. The documents also outlined a sizable portion of her estate that was to go to various charitable organizations, leaving a significant sum of money out of reach of those who had been siphoning off her wealth for years. This bombshell discovery threw everything into question. Why had Cheryl been so determined to cut these people out of her life? What had driven her to make such drastic decisions? And could this decision to alter her will have been the final straw, the act that triggered her murder? The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that Cheryl's financial affairs were not as simple as they had appeared. There were offshore accounts, hidden investments, and a labyrinthine web of business deals that had involved not just Veronica and Tiffany, but several other individuals, some of whom had been in Cheryl's life for years. These figures had quietly manipulated Cheryl's decisions, taking advantage of her trust and, in some cases, her naivety. They had siphoned money from her accounts, forged documents, and used her fame to further their own goals, all while staying just under the radar of her closest associates. As the trial of Marcus Davis continued, with the new evidence mounting, Cheryl's family found themselves caught between relief and continued heartbreak. While they were glad that the truth was coming to light, they also realized that there would be no real closure until the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. Marcus Davis had been convicted of Cheryl's murder, but as the investigation continued, it was clear that he wasn't the only one responsible. Veronica, Tiffany, and Derek all had roles to play in her downfall. And yet, they were all still free, untouched by the law. The family, now working with the authorities, pushed for a wider investigation into those who had enabled Marcus, those who had manipulated Cheryl's life for their own financial gain. As they dug deeper, they unearthed even more evidence of fraudulent transactions, fake investments, and shady business dealings. It became apparent that Cheryl's life had been built on a series of lies, each one more elaborate and dangerous than the last. With the new evidence in hand, the case took another dramatic turn. Veronica and Tiffany were arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud, and investigations into Derek's role in Cheryl's life turned up disturbing details about his ties to organized crime. The ripple effect of Cheryl's murder had uncovered a network of deceit that stretched far beyond anyone's expectations. In the end, Cheryl's story became a stark reminder of the price of ambition, the dangers of blind trust, and the devastating consequences of greed. While justice was slowly being served, the emotional scars left on her family were deep. Cheryl's legacy would forever be marked by her untimely death, and the world would remember her not just for the empire she built, but for the betrayal that led to her tragic end. As the story of Cheryl St. James comes to a close, we are reminded of the profound consequences that come with betrayal, greed, and manipulation. Her life, once filled with promise and potential, was stolen away by the very people she trusted the most. But her story does not end in tragedy. For those of us watching, it serves as a call to action. We must never turn a blind eye to the signs of manipulation in our own lives, whether it's in our personal relationships, our business dealings, or our community. Cheryl's story shows us that no matter how successful, how powerful, or how beloved someone may appear, they can still fall victim to those who prey on their trust. It's time for us to stand up against betrayal, to protect our loved ones from those who would exploit them, and to hold those responsible for their actions accountable. If you suspect something is wrong in your life or the lives of those around you, don't stay silent. Speak out. Take action. Investigate. Justice may not always be served immediately, but if we learn from the mistakes of those who came before us, we can help prevent future tragedies. Cheryl's story may be over, but her legacy can live on in the choices we make every day. Share her story, protect what's precious, and never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right. Together, we can ensure that the darkness of betrayal will never win again.